Okay, there we go. It was lagging a little bit. But yes. What? Something just came up on my thing right here, but then it went away. It must be nothing though. Fuck, I am so full. I just got done eating. No, not yet. I just got done with dinner. But yes, last we left off, both Helmholtz and Bernard are being taken away, and then John the Savage is just like, but why? And then the controller just spews out the entirety of the world's background and why it is how it is, sort of thing. Oh, hold on. Well, actually, no, I can wait. Okay. But yes. So now we continue that thing. Alright. So we're on the last two chapters, you guys. What do you think's gonna happen? You probably don't even know what's gonna happen. It's not a... I'm just gonna say, it's not a nice ending. It's not. But it's an ending. Unexpected? Maybe. I'm not sure. Well, that's what you say with everything. But who knows? Alright. Let's get on with it. Alright, so chapter 17. Art, science, you seem to have paid a fairly high price for your happiness. Let me say that again. I didn't know whose voice I was saying it in, and I assumed it was the controller, but no, it's the Savage. Art, science, you seem to have paid a fairly high price for your happiness, this said the Savage, when they were alone. Anything else? Well, religion, of course, replied the controller. There used to be something called God, before the 9 Years' War, but I was forgetting. You know all about God, I suppose. Well, the Savage hesitated. He would have liked to say something about solitude, about night, about the mesa lying pale under the moon, about the precipice, the plunge into shadowy darkness, about death. He would have liked to speak, but there were no words. Not even Shakespeare. Not even in Shakespeare. The controller, meanwhile, had crossed to the other side of the room and was unlocking a large safe set into the wall between the bookshelves. The heavy door swung open, rummaging in the darkness within. It's a subject, he said, that has always had a great interest for me. He pulled out a thick black volume. You've never read this, for example. The savage took it. The Holy Bible, containing the Old and New Testaments, he read aloud from the title page. Nor this. It was a small book and had lost its cover. The Imitation of Christ. Nor this. He handed out another volume. The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. And I've got plenty more, Mustafa Mon continued, resuming his seat. A whole collection of pornographic old books. God in the safe and forward on the shelves. He pointed out with a laugh to his avowed library, to the shelves of books, the rack full of reading machine bobbins and soundtrack rolls. But if you know about God, why don't you tell them? Asked the savage indignantly. Why don't you give them these books about God? For the same reason we don't give them Othello. They're old. They're about God hundreds of years old. They're about God hundreds of years ago, not about God now. But God doesn't change. Men do, though. What difference does that make? All the difference in the world, said Mustafa Mond. He got up again and walked to the safe. There's a man called Cardinal Newman, he said. A cardinal, he exclaimed parenthetically, was a kind of arch community songster. I, Pandulph, a fair Milan cardinal. I've read about them in Shakespeare. Of course you have. Well, as I was saying, there was a man called Cardinal Newman. Ah, here's the book. He pulled it out. And while I'm about it, I'll take this one too. It's by a man called Maine de Baran. He was a philosopher, if you know what that was. A man who dreams of fewer things than there are in heaven and earth, said the savage promptly. Quite so. I'll read you one of the things he did dream of in a moment. Meanwhile, listen to what this old arch community songster said. He opened the book at the place marked by a slip of paper and began to read. We are not our own any more than what we possess is our own. We did not make ourselves. We cannot be supreme over ourselves. We are not our own masters. We are God's property. It is not our happiness thus to view the matter. Is it not our happiness thus to view the matter? Is it any happiness or comfort to consider that we are our own? It may be thought so by the young and prosperous. These may think it a great thing to have everything, as they suppose, their own way, to depend on no one, to have to think of nothing out of sight, to be without the irksomeness of continual acknowledgement, continual prayer, continual reference of what they do to the will of another. But as time goes on, they, as all men, will find that independence was not made for man. That is an unnatural state. Hold on. It's not dense, but it's like this whole page is just, the whole next 2 pages are just like paragraphs. And it's like kind of hard, it's just all text. But as time goes on, they, as all men, will find that independence was not made for man, that is an that is an unnatural state, will do for a while, but will not carry us to safety. Will not carry us on safely to the end. Mustafa Mon paused, put down the first page, and picked up the other, and picked up, and picking up the other, turned over the pages. Take this, for example, he said, and in his deep voice once more began to read. A man grows old. He feels in himself that radical sense of weakness, of listlessness, of discomfort, which accompanies the advance of age, and feeling thus, imagines himself merely sick, lulling his fears with the notion that this distressing condition is due to some particular cause from which, as from an illness, he hopes to recover. Vain imaginings! That sickness is old age, and a horrible disease it is. They say that it is the fear of death and what comes after death that makes men turn to religion as they advance in years. But my own experience has given me the conviction that, quite apart from any such terrors or imaginings, the religious sentiment tends to develop when we grow older. To develop because as the passions grow calm, as the fancy and sensibilities are less excited and less excitable, our reason becomes less troubled in its workings, less obscured by the images, desires, and distractions in which it used to be absorbed, whereupon God emerges from whereupon God emerges as from behind a cloud. Our soul our soul feels, sees, turns toward the source of all light, turns naturally and inevitably, for now that all that all for now all for now that all yeah for now that all that gave to the world of sensations its life and charms has begun to leak away from us. Now that phenomenal existence is no more bolstered up by impressions from within or from without. We we feel the need to lean on something that abides, something that will never play us false, a reality, an absolute and everlasting truth. Yes, we inevitably turn to God, for this religious sentiment is of its nature so pure, so delightful to the soul that experiences it, that it makes up for us for all our other losses. Mustafa Mon shut the book and leaned back in his chair. One of the numerous things in heaven and earth that these philosophers didn't dream about was this. He waved his hand. Us, the modern world. You can only be independent of God while you've got youth and prosperity. Independence won't take you safely to the end. Well, we've now got youth and prosperity right up to the end. What follows? Evidently, that we can be independent of God. The religious sentiment will compensate us for all our losses. But there aren't any losses for us to compensate. Religious sentiment is superfluous. Superfluous? I feel like I'm saying that wrong. Superfluous?
Superfluous.
Superfluous. Superfluous.
Superfluous.
That one. Do I keep on saying sediment? Sentiment. Okay, for my viewers on YouTube, I have a very bad habit of saying sediment instead of sentiment. But it sounds so alike. I mean, all you do is replace the T with a D, but it sounds exactly the same. Okay, if I said sediment, but I'm saying sentiment. Alright, I will try it again. Uh, okay. Well, we've now got youth and prosperity read up to the end. What follows? Evidently, that we can be independent of God. The religious sentiment will compensate us for all our for our for all our losses. But there aren't any losses for us to compensate. Religious sentiment is superfluous. I think I said it right.
Superfluous.
Religious sentiment is superfluous. And why should we go hunting for a substitute for youthful desires when youthful desires never fail? A substitute for distractions when we go on enjoying all the old fooleries to the very last. What need have we of repose when our minds and bodies continue to delight in activity? Of consolation when we have soma? Of something immovable when there is the social order? Then why do you think there is no God? No, I think there quite probably is one. Then why? Mustafa Mon checked him. But he manifests himself in different ways to different men. In pre-modern times, he manifested himself as the being that's described in these books. Now, how does he manifest himself now? Asked the savage. Well, he manifests himself as an absence, as though he weren't there at all. That's your fault. Call it the fault of civilization. God isn't compatible with machinery and scientific medicine and universal happiness. You must make your choice. Our civilization has chosen machinery and medicine and happiness. That's why I have to keep these books locked up in the safe. They're smut. People would be shocked if... The savage interrupted him. But isn't it natural to feel there's a God? You might as well ask if it's natural to do up one's trousers with zippers, said the controller sarcastically. You remind me of another of those old fellows called Bradley. He defined philosophy as the finding of bad reason for what one believes by instinct, as if one believed anything by instinct. One believes things because one has been conditioned to believe them. Finding bad reasons for what one believes for other bad reasons. That's philosophy. People believe in God because they've been conditioned to believe in God. But all the same, insisted the savage, it is natural to believe in God when you're alone, quite alone, in the night thinking about death. But people never are alone now, said Mustafa Mond. We make them hate solitude, and we arrange their lives so that it's almost impossible for them ever to have it. The savage nodded gloomily. At Malpais, he had suffered because they had shut him out of the communal activities of the pueblo. In civilized London, he was suffering because he could never escape from those communal activities. never to never be quietly alone. Do you remember do you remember that do you remember that bit in King Lear? Said the savage at last. The gods are just the gods are just, and of our pleasant vices make instruments to plague us. The dark and vicious place where he got cost him his eyes. And Edward answers, You remember he's wounding. You remember he's wounded, he's dying. Thou hast spoken right. 'Tis true. The wheel has come full circle. I am here. What about now? Doesn't there seem to be a God managing things, punishing, rewarding? Well, does there? Questioned the controller in his turn. You can indulge in any number of pleasant vices with a free martin, and run no risks of having your eyes put out by your son's mistress. The wheel has come full circle. I am here. But where would Edmund be nowadays? Sitting in a pneumatic chair with his arm around a girl's waist, sucking away at his sex hormone chewing gum, and looking at the feelies. The gods are just, no doubt, but their code of law is dictated, in the last resort, by the people who organize society. Providence takes its cue from men. Are you sure? Asked the savage. Are you quite sure that the Edmund in the pneumatic chair hasn't been just a heavily Are you quite sure that the Edmund in that pneumatic chair hasn't been just as heavily punished as the Edmund who's wounded and bleeding to death? The gods are just. Haven't they used his pleasant vices as an instrument to degrade him? Degrade him from what position? As a happy, hard-working, good, consuming citizen, he's perfect. Of course, if you choose some other standard than ours, then perhaps you might say he was degraded. But you've got to stick to one set of postulates. You can't play electromagnetic golf according to the rules of centrifugal bumblepuppy. But value dwells not in particular will, said the savage. It holds his estimate in dignity as well wherein 'tis precious of itself as in the prizer. Hold on, let me read that again. But it holds his estimate and dignity as well wherein 'tis precious of itself as in the prizer. Okay. Come. Protested Mustafa Mond. That's going rather far, isn't it? If you allowed yourselves to think of God, you wouldn't allow yourselves to be degraded by pleasant vices. You'd have a reason for bearing things patiently, for doing things that with courage. I've seen it with the Indians. I'm sure you have, said Mustafa Mond. But then, we aren't Indians. There isn't any need for a civilized man to bear anything that's seriously unpleasant. And as for doing things, Ford forbid that he should get the idea into his head, it would upset the whole social order of men. It would upset the whole social order if men started doing things on their own. What about self-denial then? If you had a God, you'd have a reason for self-denial. But industrial civilization is only possible when there's no self-denial. Self-indulgence up to the very limits imposed by hygiene and economics. Yeah, yeah, dude. It's like, it gets up there. Tell me your mixed feelings while I'm gonna finish reading this chapter, because it's almost done. Well, not almost, but it's sort of done. Almost done. Uh, but industrial civilization is only possible when there's no self-denial. Self-indulgence up to the very limits imposed by hygiene and economics. Otherwise, the wheel stops turning. You'd have a reason for chastity, said the savage, blushing a little as he spoke the words. But chastity means passion. Chastity means neurasthenia? I think that's what it is. Hold on. Neuroaesthesia. Neuro. Okay. I'm gonna. No, I was talking about the reason guard. That's what I was talking about. Neurasthenia. Neurasthenia. Oh, okay. Which, okay, I should probably say what the definition of that is. Wait. Neurasthenia. Oh, okay. So it's a term that was first used, at least in the early 1929, to label the mechanical weakness of the nerves, and would become a major diagnosis in North America during blah blah blah. Okay. What is it called today? What's oh? It's called ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome. Weird. Neurasthenia. An ill-defined medical condition characterized by lassitude, fatigue, headache, and irritability. Okay. But chastity means passion. Chastity means neurasthenia. Chastity means neurasthenia, and passion and neurasthenia mean instability. And instability means the end of civilization. You can't have a lasting civilization without plenty of pleasant vices. Chastity means losing. Yes, it does. But God's the reason for everything noble and fine and heroic. If you had a God, my dear young friend, said Mustafa Mond, civilization has absolutely no need for nobility or heroism. These things are symptoms of political inefficiency. It is a properly organized society like in a properly organized society like ours. Nobody has any opportunities for being noble or heroic. Conditions have got to be thoroughly unstable before the occasion can arise. Where there are wars, where there are divided allegiances, where there are temptations to be resisted, objects of love to be fought for or defended, where obviously nobility and heroism have some sense. But there aren't any way, but there aren't any wars nowadays. The greatest care is taken to prevent you from loving anyone too much. There is no such thing as a divided allegiance. You're so conditioned that you can't help doing what you ought to do. And what you ought to do is, on the whole, so pleasant. So many of the natural impulses are allowed free play. So that there that there aren't that there really aren't many any let me say that again. And what you ought to do is, on the whole, so pleasant. So many of the natural impulses are allowed free play that there really aren't any temptations to resist. And if ever, by some unlucky chance, anything unpleasant should somehow happen, why, there's always someone to give you a holiday from the facts. And there's always someone to calm your anger, to reconcile you to your enemies, to make you patient and long suffering, to make you patient and long suffering. In the past, you could only accomplish these things by making a great effort, and after years of hard moral training, now you swallow 2 or 3 half-gram tablets, and there you are. Anybody can be virtuous now. You can carry at least half your mortality about in a bottle. Yeah, you could carry at least half your mortality in about. Let me say it again. I keep on mixing up the words. You can carry at least half your mortality about in a bottle. Christianity without tears. That's what Soma is. But the tears are necessary. Don't you remember what Othello said? If after every tempest came such calms, may the wind blow till they have weakened death. There's a story one of the old Indians used to tell us about the girl of Mataski. The young men who wanted to marry her had to do a morning's hoeing in her garden. It seemed easy, but there were flies and mosquitoes, magic ones. Most of the young men simply couldn't stand the biting and stinging, but the one that could, he got the girl. Charming. But in civilized countries, said the controller, you can have girls without hoeing for them, and there aren't any flies or mosquitoes to sting you. We got rid of them all centuries ago. The savage nodded, frowning. You got rid of them. Yes, that's just like you. Getting rid of everything unpleasant instead of learning to put up with it. Whether 'tis better in mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. But you don't do either. Neither suffer nor oppose. You just abolish the slings and arrows. It's too easy. He was suddenly silent, thinking of his mother. In her room on the 37th floor, Linda was Linda had floated in a sea of singing lights and perfumed caresses, floated away out in space, out of out of space, out of time, out of the prison of her memories, her habits, her aged and bloated body. And Tomakin, ex-director of hatcheries and conditioning, Tomakin was still on holiday from humiliation and pain, in a world where he could not hear those words, that derisive laughter, could not see that hideous face, feel those moist, flabby arms around his neck, in a beautiful world. What you need, the savage went on, is something with tears for a change. Nothing costs enough here. $12.5 million. Henry Foster had protested when the savage told him that. 12.5 million, that's what the new conditioning center cost. Not a cent less. Exposing what is moral and unsure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare, not even for an eggshell. Isn't there something in that? Isn't there something in that? He asked, looking up at Mustafa Mond. Quite apart from God, though of course God would be a reason for it. Isn't there something in living dangerously? Quite apart from God, though of course God would be a reason for it. Isn't there something in living dangerously? There's a great deal in it, said the controller replied. Men and women must have their adrenals stimulated from time to time. What? Questioned the savage, uncomprehending. Oh shit, you said something. You don't need God to be. Yep, you don't need God to be heroic. You don't need God to save the day, because, of course, they always depict him like heroic and noble. But, like, what's happening in the world, like, people getting sick, people getting cancer, people getting these horrible diseases, and just, like, a lot of bad stuff. Like, God is not stepping up if he were really real, and if he claimed to love everyone. So that in all is bullshit. All what they're saying. Yeah. I'm just like, sure, there might be coincidences where you pray for something to happen, pray for something good, and it does happen, but I feel like that's just coincidence and not anything else. It's just a stroke of luck. What? Questioned the savage, uncomprehending. It's one of the conditions of perfect health. That's why we made the VPS treatments compulsory. VPS? Violent passion surrogate. Regularly once a month. We flood the whole system with adrenaline. It's a complete physiological equivalent of fear and rage. All the tonic effects of murdering Desdemona and being murdered by Othello, without any of the conveniences. Not conveniences, inconveniences. Let me say that again. All the tonic effects of murdering Desdemona and being murdered by Othello, without any of the inconveniences. But I like the inconveniences. We don't, said the controller. We prefer to do things comfortably. But I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. In fact, said Mustafa Mond, you're claiming the right to be unhappy. All right then, said the savage defiantly. I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what might happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. There was a long silence. I claim them all, said the savage at last. Mustafa Mon shrugged his shoulders. You're welcome, he said. And that is the end of chapter 17. Ooh, baby, we're getting to the last chapter of the last book, of this book. What's gonna happen? I know what's gonna happen. I don't think I could. Yeah. I mean, if I were in his situation where, like, I knew my mother was from, like, this great place, I'd just be like, yeah, sign me up. This looks cool. I want to suffer. Yeah. You lost me there. Yeah, that's relatable. Alright, you guys, on to the last chapter of this book. It's gonna be a wild, wild, wild ride. I don't think you will expect the ending. Maybe you will, like, towards the end. You'll be like, but, like, I don't think you're gonna expect this ending. And it ends abruptly. When I say that, it ends abruptly. Okay. So, chapter 18. The door was ajar. They entered. John! From the bathroom came an unpleasant and characteristic sound. Is there anything the matter? Helmholtz called. There was no answer. The unpleasant sound was repeated twice. There was silence. Then, with a click, the bathroom door opened, and, very pale, the savage emerged. I say, Helmholtz exclaimed solicitously. I'm trying to say this fast and, like, not like I'm pronouncing it out. Solicitously. Okay. I say, Helmholtz exclaimed solicitously. Hold on. Solicitously. Helmholtz exclaimed solicitously. I want to keep on saying, I want to say Sicily, but no, no. Wrong. I know I'm saying it right. It's just, it's like a tongue twister. I can't. Solicitously. I say, Helmholtz exclaimed solicitously. You do look ill, John. Did you eat something that didn't agree with you? Asked Bernard. The savage nodded. I ate civilization. What? It poisoned me. I was defiled, and then, he added in a lower tone, I ate my own wickedness. Yes, but what exactly? I mean, just how were... I mean, just now you were... Now I am purified, said the savage. I drank some mustard and warm water. The other stared at him in astonishment. Do you mean to say that you were doing it on purpose? Do you mean to say you were doing it on purpose? Asked Bernard. That's how the Indians always purify themselves. He sat down and sighing, passing his hand across his forehead. I shall rest for a few minutes, he said. I'm rather tired. Well, I'm not surprised, said Helmholtz, after a silence. We've come to say goodbye. He went on in another tone. We're off tomorrow morning. Yes, we're off tomorrow, said Bernard, on whose face the savage remarked a new expression of determined resignation. And by the way, John, he continued, leaning forward in his chair and laying a hand on the savage's knee, I want to say how sorry I am for everything that happened yesterday. He blushed. How ashamed, he went on, in spite of this unsteadiness of his voice. How really... The savage cut him short and, taking his hand, affectionately pressed it. Helmholtz was wonderful to me, Bernard resumed after a little pause. If it hadn't been for him, I should... Now, Helmholtz protested. There was a silence. In spite of their sadness because of it, even for their sadness was the symptom of their love for one another. The three young men were happy. I went to see the controller this morning, said the savage at last. What for? To ask if I mightn't go to the islands with you. And what did he say? Said Helmholtz eagerly. The savage shook his head. He wouldn't let me. Why not? He said he wanted to go on with the experiment, but I'm damned, the savage added with a fury. I'm damned if I'll go on being experimented with. Not for all the controllers in the world. I shall go away tomorrow, too. But where? The others asked in unison. The savage shrugged his shoulders. Anywhere. I don't care, as long as I can be alone. From Guildford, the down line followed the Wey Valley to Gold. From Guildford, the down line. From Guildford, the down line followed the Wey Valley to Godalming, then over Milford and Whitley, proceeded to Haslemere and on through Petersfield toward Sportsmouth. Roughly parallel to it, the upline passed over Warpliston, Tongham, Puttenham, Elstead, and Gracehot. Between the Hog's Back and the Hind Head, there were points where the two lines did not. Between the Hog's Head and the Hind Point, there were points where the two lines were not more than 6 or 7 kilometers apart. The distance was too small for careless flyers, particularly at night, and when they had taken half a gram too much, there had been accidents, serious ones. It had been decided to deflect the upline a few kilometers to the west, between Grayshot and the Tongham for abandoned air lighthouses marked the course for the old Portsmouth to London road. The skies above them were silent and deserted. It was over Selborne, Bordon, and Farnham that the helicopters now carelessly hummed and roared. The savage had chosen in his hermitage the old lighthouse which Yeah, the savage had chosen as his hermitage the old lighthouse which stood on the crest of the hill between Puttenham and Elstead. The building was of ferro concrete and in excellent condition. Almost too comfortable, the savage had thought. Almost too comfortable, the savage had thought when he first explored the place. Almost too civilizedly luxurious. He pacified his conscience by promising himself a compensatingly harder self-discipline, purifications, the more complete and thorough. His first night in the hermitage was deliberately a sleepless one. He had he spent hours on his knees, praying now to the heaven from which the guilty Claudius begged forgiveness, now to the Zuni, or the Zwini, to Awan Awanawilla, Awanawillona, Awana. Sorry, again, Awanawillona. Now in Zwini to Awanawillona. Now to Jesus in Pukong. Now to his own guardian angel, the eagle. From time to time he stretched out his arms as though he were on the cross, and held them thus through long minutes of an ache that gradually increased till it became a tremulous and excruciating agony. Held them in voluntary crucifixion, while he repeated, though through clenched teeth, the sweat meanwhile pouring down his face, "Oh, forgive me! Oh, make me pure! Oh, help me to be good!" again and again, till he was on the point of fainting from the pain. When morning came, he felt he had earned the right to inhabit the lighthouse. Yet, even though there was still, yet, even though there still was glass in most of the windows, even though the view from the platform was so fine, for the very reason why he had chosen the lighthouse had become almost instantly a reason for going somewhere else. He had decided to live there because the view was so beautiful, because from his vantage point he seemed to be looking out on in he seemed to be looking out onto the incarnation of a divine being. But who was he to be pampered with the daily and hourly sight of loveliness? Was he going to be living in the visible presence of God? Oh, who was he to be living in the visible presence of God? All he deserved to live in was some filthy sty, some blind hole in the ground, stiff and still, aching after his long night of pain. But for that very reason, inwardly reassured, he climbed up to the platform of his tower. He looked out over the bright sunrise. He looked out over the bright sunrise world, where he had regained the right to inhabit. On the north, the view was bounded by the long chalk ridge of the Hog's Back. From behind whose eastern extremity rose the towers of the 7 skyscrapers which constituted Guildford. Seeing them, the savage made a grimace, but he was to become reconciled to them in course of time. For a night, seeing them, the savage made a grimace, but he was to become reconciled to them in course of time. For at night they twinkled gaily with geometrical constellations, or else flood-lighted, pointed their luminous fingers, with a gesture whose significance nobody in England but the savage now understood. With a gesture whose significance nobody in England but the savage now understood, solemnly towards the plumness, the plumless, the plump, not plump, plumness, plumless mysteries of heaven. In the valley which separated the Hogsback from the sandy hill on which the lighthouse stood, Puttenham was a modest little village, 9 stories high, with silos, a poultry farm, and a small vitamin D factory. On the other side of the lighthouse, towards the south, the ground fell away in long slopes of heather to a chain of ponds. Yeah, let me say that again. On the other side of the lighthouse, towards the south, the ground fell away in long slopes of heather to a chain of ponds. Beyond them, above the intervening woods, rose the 14-story tower of Elstead, dim in the hazy English air. Hindhead and Selborne invited the eye into a blue romantic distance, but it was not alone the distance that had attracted the savage to his lighthouse. The near was as seductive, but it was not alone the distance that had attracted the savage to the lighthouse. The near was as seductive as the far. The woods, the open stretches of heather and yellow gorse, the clumps of Scotch firs, the shining ponds with their overhanging birch trees, their water lilies, their beds of rushes. These were beautiful, and to an eye accustomed to aridities, and to an eye accustomed to the aridities of the American desert, astonishing. And then the solitude. Whole days passed during which he never saw a human being. The lighthouse was only a quarter of an hour's flight from the Charnty Tower, but the hills of Malpais were hardly more deserted than this Surrey heath. The crowds that daily left London left it only to play electric magnetic golf or tennis. Puttenham possessed no links. The nearest Riemann surfaces were at Guildford. Flowers and landscape were the only attractions here. And so, as there was no good reason for coming, nobody came. During the first days, the savage lived alone and undisturbed. Of the money which, on his first arrival, John had received for his personal expenses, most had been spent on his equipment. Before leaving London, he had bought four viscose woolen blankets, rope and string, nails, glue, a few tools, matches, though he intended in due course to make a fire drill, some pots and pans, 2 dozen packets of seeds, and 10 kilograms of wheat flour. No, not synthetic starch and cotton waste flour substitute, he had insisted, even though it is more nourishing. But when it came to pan-glandular biscuits and vitamized beef surrogate, he had not been able to resist the shopman's persuasion. Looking at the tins now, he bitterly reproached himself for his weakness. Loathsome, civilized stuff. He had made up his mind that he would never eat it, even if he were starving. That'll teach them, he thought vindictively. It would also teach him. He counted his money. The little that remained would be enough, he hoped, to tide him over the winter. By next spring, his garden would be producing enough to make him independent of the world outside. Meanwhile, There would be, meanwhile, there would always be game. He had seen plenty of rabbits, and there were waterfowl on the ponds. He set to work at once to make a bow and he set at, he set to work at once to make a bow and arrows. There were ash trees. There were ash trees near the lighthouse, and for arrow shafts, a whole copse full of beautifully striped hazel saplings. He began by felling a he began by felling a young ash, cut out 6 feet of end branch stem, stripped off the bark, and paring by paring, shaved away and par and paring by paring, shaved away the white wood, as old Mitsima had taught him, until he had a stave of his own height, stiff as the thickened center, lively and quick, at the slender tips. The work gave him an intense pleasure. After those weeks of idleness in London with nothing to do, whenever he wanted anything but to press a switch or turn a handle, it was pure delight to be doing something that demanded skill and patience. He had almost finished whittling the stave into shape when he realized with a start that he was singing. Singing! It was as though, stumbling upon himself from the outside, he had suddenly caught himself out, taken himself fragrantly at fault. Guiltily he blushed. After all, it was not to sing to enjoy himself that he had come here. It was to escape further contamination by the filth of civilized life. It was to be so purified and made good. It was actively to make amends. He realized to his dismay that, absorbed in the whittling of his bow, he had forgotten that he had sworn himself he would constantly remember poor Linda and his own murderous unkindness to her, and those loathsome twins, swarming like lice across the mystery of her death, insulting with their presence not merely his own grief and repentance, but the very gods themselves. He had sworn to remember. He had sworn unceasingly to make amends. And there he was, sitting happily over his bow stave, singing, actually singing. He went indoors, opened a box of mustard, and put some water to boil on the fire. Half an hour later, 3 Delta Minus land workers from one of the Putnam Buchanovsky groups happened to be driving to Elstead, and at the top of the hill were astonished to see a young man standing outside the abandoned lighthouse, stripped to the waist and hitting himself with a whip of knotted cords. His back was horizontally streaked with crimson, and from wheel to wheel ran thick trickles of blood. The driver of the lorry pulled up at the side of the road, and with his 2 companions stared open-mouthed at the extraordinary spectacle. 1, 2, 3. They counted the strokes. After the 8th, the young man interrupted himself. After the 8th, the young man interrupted his self-punishment to run to the wood's edge, and there be violently sick. When he had finished, he picked up the whip and began hitting himself again. 9, 10, 11, 12. Ford! Whispered the driver, and his twins were of the same opinion. 40! He said. 3 days after, like turkey buzzards settling on a corpse, the reporters came, dried and hardened over a slow fire of greenwood, The bow was steady. The savage was busy on his arrows. 36 hazel sticks had been whittled and dried, tipped with sharp nails, carefully nocked. He made he had made a raid one night on Puttenham. He had made a raid one night on the Puttenham poultry farm, and now had feathers enough to equip a whole armory. It was at work upon the feathering of his shafts that the first of the reporters found him. Noiseless on his pneumatic shoes, the men came up from behind him. "Good morning, Mr. Savage," he said. I am the representative of the hourly radio." Startled, as though by the bite of a snake, the savage sprang to his feet, scattering the arrows, feathers, blue pot, and brush in all directions. "I beg your pardon?" said the reporter, with genuine compunction. "I had no intention." He touched his hat, the aluminum stovepipe hat in which he carried his wireless receiver and transmitter. Excuse my not taking it. Excuse my not taking it off," he said. "It's a bit heavy. Well, as I was saying, I am the representative of the hourly. What do you want?" said the savage, scowling. The reporter returned to his in. The reporter. Hold on. The reporter returned his most ingratiating smile. "Well, of course, our readers would be profoundly interested." He put his head on one side. His smile became almost coquettish. "Just a few words with you, Mr. Savage." And rapidly, with a series of ritual gestures, he uncoiled two wires connected to the portable battery. He uncoiled two wires connected to the portable battery. Hold on. Yeah, okay. I just wasn't paying attention. And rapidly, with a series of ritual gestures, he uncoiled two wires connected to the portable battery buckled around his waist, plugged them simultaneously to the sides of his aluminum hat, touched a spring on the crown, and antennae shot up into the air, touched another spring on the peak of the brim, and, like a jack-in-the-box, out jumped a microphone and hung there, quivering 6 inches in front of his nose. Pulled down a pair of receivers over his ears, pressed the switch on the left side. Sorry, I just had something in my throat just now. And like a jack-in-the-box, jumped out a microphone and hung there, quivering 6 inches in front of his nose. Pulled down a pair of receivers over his ears, pressed a switch on the left side of the hat, and from within came a faint, waspy buzzing. Turned a knob to the right, and the buzzing was interrupted by a stethoscope wheeze and cackle, by hiccups and sudden squeaks. "Hello?" he said to the microphone. "Hello, hello?" A bell suddenly rang inside his hat. "Is that you, Itzel?" Primo Melon speaking. "Yes, I've got a hold of him. Mr. Savage, will you now?" I've got a hold of him. Mr. Savage will now take the microphone and say a few words. Won't you, Mr. Savage? He looked up at the Savage with another one of those winning smiles of his. Just tell our readers why you came here. What made you leave London? Hold on, Edsel. So very suddenly, and of course, that whip. The Savage started. How do they know about the whip? We're all crazy to know about the whip. And then something about civilization. You know, that sort of stuff. What I think of the civilized girl. Just a few words. Just a few words. A very few. The Savage obeyed with a disconcerting literalness. 5 words he uttered, and no more. 5 words. The same as those he had said to Bernard about the arch community songster of Canterbury. Honey, sons estos tonight. And seizing the reporter by the shoulder, he spun him around. The young man revealed himself invitingly. The young man revealed himself invitingly, well covered, aimed and with all the force and accuracy of a champion foot and mouth baller, delivered a most prodigious kick. 8 minutes later, a new edition of the hourly radio was on sale in the streets of London. Hold on, there's a word that's coming up and I don't know how to repeat it. Coccyx. Okay. Yeah. 8 minutes later, a new edition of the hourly radio was on sale in the streets of London. Hourly radio reporter had Coccyx kicked by Mystery Savage, ran the headlines in the front page. Sensation in Surrey. Sensation even in London, thought the reporter when, on his return, he read the words. In a very painful sensation, what was more. He sat down gingerly to his luncheon. Undeterred by that cautionary bruise on their colleague's coccyx, 4 other reporters representing the New York Times, the Frankfurt Four-Dimensional Continuum, the Fortean Science Monitor, and the Delta Mirror called that afternoon at the lighthouse and met with perceptions of progressively increasing violence. From a safe distance and still rubbing his buttocks, "Benighted fool!" shouted the man from the Fortean Science Monitor. "Why don't you take Soma? Get away!" The Savage took his fist. The Savage took his fist. The other retreated a few steps and turned around again. Evils and unreality if you take a couple of grams. Kohakwa iyathoknyai. Kohakwa iyath tokwai. The tone was menacingly derisive. Pain's an illusion. No, pain's a delusion. "Oh, is it?" said the Savage, and picking up a thick hazel switch, straight forward. The man from the Fortean Science Monitor made a dash for his helicopter. After that, the Savage was left for a time in peace. A few helicopters came by and hovered inquisitively around the tower. He shot an arrow into the inopportunately. Oh, okay. He shot an arrow into the impor. It's not inopportune. It's importunately. Importantly. Hold on. I'm gonna go mad, you guys. Import. Import.
Importunate.
Importunately. Okay. He shot an arrow. He shot an arrow into the importunate. What was it? Fuck! I just fucking forgot.
Importunate.
Importunately. He shot an arrow into the unfortunately. He shot an arrow into the unfortunately nearest of them. It pierced the aluminum floor of the cabin. There was a shrill yell, and the machine went rocketing up into the air with the acceleration of its supercharger could give it. The others, in future, kept their distance respectively, ignoring their tiresome humming. He likened himself in his imagination to one of the suitors. He likened himself in his imagination to one of the suitors of the mating of Matatsky, unmoved and persistent among the winged vermin. The savage dug out what was to be his garden. After a time, the vermin evidently became bored and flew away. For hours at a stretch, the day above his head was empty, and for the larks, silent. The weather was breathlessly hot. The weather was breathlessly hot. There was thunder in the air. He had dug all the morning and was resting, stretched out along the floor. And suddenly the thought of Lenina was a real presence. Naked and tangible, saying sweet and put your arms round me, and shoes and socks, perfumed, impudent, strumpet, but her arms round his neck, the lifting of her breasts, her mouth. Eternity was on her lips and eyes. Lenina, no, 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 no. He sprang to his feet and, half naked as he was, ran out of the house. At the ledge of the heath stood a clump of hoary juniper bushes. He flung himself against them. He embraced not the smooth body of his desires, but an armful of green spikes, sharp with 1,000 points, and they pricked him. He tried to think of poor Linda, breathless and dumb, with her clutching hands and the unutterable terror in her eyes. Poor Linda, whom he had sworn to remember. But it was still the presence of Lenina that haunted him, Lenina whom he had promised to forget, even though the stab and sting of the juniper needles. His wincing flesh was aware of her, unescapably real. Sweet, sweet. And if you wanted me to, why didn't you? The whip was hanging on a nail by the door, ready to hand against the arrival of reporters. In a frenzy, the savage ran back to the door, seized it, and whirled it. The knotted cords bit into his flesh. Strumpet! Strumpet! He shouted at every blow as though it were Lenina, and how frantically, without knowing it, he wished it were. White, warm, scented, infamous Lenina that he was flogging thus. Strumpet! And then, in a voice of despair, "Oh, Linda, forgive me, God! I'm bad, I'm wicked, no, you strumpet! He, from his carefully constructed hide in the wood 300 meters away, Darwin Bonaparte, the Feely Corporation's the most expert big game photographer, had watched the whole proceeding. Patience and skill had been rewarded. He had spent 3 days sitting inside the bowl of an artificial oak tree, 3 nights crawling on his belly through the heather, hiding microphones in gorse bushes, burying wires in the soft gray sand. 72 hours of profound discomfort. But now the great moment had come. The greatest Darwin Bonaparte had time to reflect. He had moved among his instruments, the greatest since his taking of the infamous howling, stereoscopic feelie of the gorilla's wedding. Splendid, he said himself. He said to himself as the savage started his astonishing performance. Splendid. He kept his telescope he kept his telescope cameras carefully aimed, glued to their moving objective, clapping on a higher power to get a close-up of the frantic and distorted face. Admirable. Switched over, and for half a minute in slow motion, an exquisitely comical effect, he promised himself. Listen in, meanwhile, to the blows, the groans, the wild and the raving words that were being recorded on the soundtrack at the edge of his film. Tried the effect of a little amplification. Yes, that was decidedly better. It was delighted to hear, in a momentary lull, the shrill singing of a lark. The shrill singing of a lark. Wished the savage would turn round so that he could get a good close-up of the blood on his back. And almost instantly, what astonishing luck! The accommodating fellow did turn around, and he was able to take a perfect close-up. Well, that was grand, he said to himself when it was all over. Really grand. He mopped his face. When they had put in the feely effects at the studio, it would be a wonderful film. Almost as good, thought Darwin Bonaparte, as the sperm whale's love life. And that, by Ford, was saying a good deal. 12 days later, the savage Surrey had been released and could be seen, heard, and felt in every first-class feely palace in Western Europe. The effect of Darwin Bonaparte's film was immediately enormous. On the afternoon which followed the evening of its release, John's rustic solitude was suddenly broken by the arrival overhead of a great swarm of helicopters. He was digging in his garden, digging, too, in his own mind, laboriously churning up the substance he had thought, death. And he dove in his spade once more. And he dove in his spade once and again, yet again. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to the dusty death. Hold on, wait. Let me say this again. He was digging in his garden, digging, too, in his own mind, laboriously turning up the substance of his thought, death. And he drove in his spade once and again, and yet again. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. A convincing thunder rumbled through the words. He lifted another spadeful of earth. Why had Linda died? Why had she been allowed to become gradually less than human, and at last, he shuddered. A good kissing carry-on. He planted his foot on his spade and stamped it furiously into the tough ground. As flies to wanton boys are, we are. As flies to wanton boys are, we to the gods. They kill us for sport. Thunder again. Words that proclaimed themselves true, truer somehow than truth itself. And yet that same Gloucester Gloucester? And yet that same Gloucester, yeah, and yet that same Gloucester has had called them very gentle gods. Besides, thy best rest to sleep, and that though oft provokest, yet grossly fierce thy death, which is no more than sleep. Sleep, perchance perchance to dream. His spade struck again, and his spade struck against stone. He stooped to pick it up, for in that sleep of death, what dreams? A humming overhead had become an uproar, and suddenly he was in shadow, and there was something in between the sun and him. He looked up, startled with his digging and he looked up, startled from his digging, from his thoughts, looked up in a dazzled bewilderment, his mind still wandering in that other world of truer than truth, still focused on the immensities of death and deity, looked up and saw, close above him, the square of hovering machines. Like locusts they came, hung poised, descended all around him on the heather, and out from the bellies of these giant grasshoppers stepped men in white viscose flannels, women, for the weather was hot, in acetate shin-hung pajamas, or velveteen shorts and sleeveless half unzippered slinglets. One couple from each. In a few minutes there were dozens of them, standing in a wide circle around the lighthouse, staring, laughing, clicking their cameras, throwing, as to an ape, peanuts, packets of sex hormone chewing gum, panglandular petite berets, and every moment, for across the hog's back, the stream of traffic now flowed unceasingly. Their numbers increased. As in a nightmare, the dozens became scores, scores hundreds. The savage had retreated towards cover, and now in the posture of an animal at bay, stood with his back to the wall of the lighthouse, staring from him face to face in speechless horror, like a man out of his senses. "Go away!" he shouted. The ape had spoken. There was a burst of laughter and hand-clapping. "Good old savage! Hurrah, hurrah!" And through the babel he heard cries of, "Whip! Whip! The whip!" Acting on the word's suggestion, he seized the bunch of knotted cords from its tail behind the door and shook it at the tormentors. There was a yell of ironical applause. Menacingly, he advanced toward them. A woman cried out in fear. The line wavered at its most menacingly, he advanced toward them. A woman cried out in fear. The line wavered at its most immediately threatened point. The line wavered at its most immediately threatened point, then stiffened again, stood firm. The consciousness of being an overwhelming force had given these sights. The consciousness of being an overwhelming force had given these sightseers a courage which the savage had not expected of them. Taken aback, he halted and looked around. "Why don't you leave me alone?" There was almost there was an almost plaintive note in his anger. "Have a few magnesium salted almonds," said the man who, if the savage would advance, would be the first to be attacked. He held out a packet. "They're really very good, you know," he added, with a rather nervous smile of propitiation. "And the magnesium salts will help you to keep you young." The savage ignored his offer. "What do you want with me?" he asked, turning from one grinning face to another. "What do you want with me?" "The whip." "The whip," answered the hundred voices confusedly. "Do the whipping stunt. Let's see the whipping stunt." Then, in unison and on a slow, heavy rhythm, "We want the whip," shouted a group at the end of the line. "We want the whip." Others at once took up the cry, and the phrase was repeated, parrot fashion, again and again, with an ever-growing volume of sound, until by the seventh or eighth reiteration, no other words was being spoken. Yeah, the whip. "We want the whip!" They were all crying together, and intoxicated by the noise, unanimity, the sense of rhythmical atonement, they might, it seemed, have gone on for hours. When they, oh yeah, I guess so. They were all crying together, and intoxicated by the noise, the unanimity, the sense of rhythmical atonement, they might, it seemed, to have gone on for hours, almost indefinitely. Um, but at about the 25th repetition, the proceedings were startlingly interrupted. Yet another helicopter had arrived from across the hog's back, hung poised above the crowd, then dropped within a few yards of where the savage was standing, in the open space between the line of sightseers and the lighthouse. The roar of the air screws momentarily drowned the shouting. Then, as the machine touched the ground and engines were, the roar and the hold on. Yet another yeah, let me start there. Yet another helicopter had arrived from across the hog's back, hung poised above the crowd, then dropped within a few yards of where the savage was standing, in the open space between the line of sightseers and the lighthouse. The roar of the air screws momentarily drowned the shouting. Then, as the machine touched the ground, the uproar of the air screws momentarily drowned the shouting. Then, as the machine touched the ground and the engines were turned off, "We want the whip! We want the whip!" broke out again in the same loud, insistent monotone. The door of the helicopter opened, and out stepped, first, a fair and ruddy-faced young man, and then in green velveteen shorts, white shirt, and jockey cap, a young woman. At the sight of the woman, the savage recoiled, turned pale. The young woman stood, smiling at him, an uncertain, imploring, almost abject smile. The seconds passed. Her lips moved. She was saying something, but the noise of her voice was covered by the loud, reiterated refrain of the sightseers. "We want the whip! We want the whip!" The young woman pressed both hands to her left side, and then on that peach bright, dull, beautiful face of hers appeared a strangely incongruous expression of yearning distress. Her blue eyes seemed to grow larger, brighter, and suddenly 2 tears rolled off her cheeks. Inaudibly, she spoke again, then, with a quick, impassioned gesture, stretched out her arms toward the savage, stepped forward. "We want the whip! We want—" And all of a sudden, they had what they wanted. "Strumpet!" The savage had rushed at her like a madman. "Fichu!" Like a madman, he was slashing at her with his whip of small cords. Terrified, she had turned to flee, had tripped and fallen in the heather. "Henry! Henry!" she shouted, but her ruddy-faced companion had bolted out of harm's way behind the helicopter. With a whoop of delighted excitement, the line broke. There was a convergent stampede towards that magnetic center of attraction. Pain was a fascinating horror. "Fry! Lechery! Fry!" Frenzied, the savage slashed again. Hungrily, they gathered round, pushing and scrambling like swine about the trough. "Oh, the flesh! The flesh!" The savage ground his teeth. This time it was on his shoulders that the whip descended. "Kill it! Kill it!" Drawn by the fascination of the horror of pain from within. Drawn by the fascination of the horror of pain and from within, impelled by that habit of cooperation, that desire for unanimity. Sorry. What was I? Okay. Drawn by the fascination of the horror of pain and from within, impelled by that habit of cooperation, that desire for unanimity, and atonement, which their conditioning had so in hold on. Okay. Alright. Okay, drawn by the fascination of the horror of pain and from within, impelled by that habit of cooperation, that desire for unanimity and atonement, which their conditioning had so ineradicably implanted in them, they began to mime the frenzy of his gestures, striking at one another as the savage struck at his own rebellious flesh, or at that plump incarnation of turpitude writhing in the heather at his feet. Kill it! Kill it! Kill it! The savage went on shouting. Then suddenly somebody started singing Orgy Porgy, and in a moment they had all caught up the refrain and singing had begun to dance. Orgy Porgy, round, round and round and round, beating one another in 6/8 time. Orgy Porgy. It was after midnight when the last of the helicopters took its flight. I can just feel someone about to interrupt me. I can just feel it. And I'm on the last page. Okay. It was after midnight when the last of the helicopters took its flight. Stupefied by soma and exhausted by a long drawn frenzy of sensuality, the savage lay sleeping in the heather. The sun was already high when he awoke. He lay for a moment, blinking in owlish incomprehension at the light, and then suddenly remembered everything. Oh, oh my God, my God! He covered his eyes with his hand. That evening, the swarm of helicopters came buzzing round the hog's back. That evening, the swarm of helicopters that came buzzing across the hog's back was a dark cloud 10 kilometers long. The description of last night's orgy of atonement had been in all the papers. Savage! Called the first arrivals as they alighted from their machine. Mr. Savage! There was no answer. The door of the lighthouse is ajar. They pushed it open and walked into a shuddering twilight. Through an archway on the further side of the room, they could see the bottom of the staircase that led up to the higher floors. Just under the crown. just under the crown. Just under the crown of the arch. Just under the crown of the arch dangled a pair of feet. Mr. Savage! Slowly, very slowly, like two unhurried compass needles, the feet turned towards the right, north, northeast, east, southeast, south, southwest, then paused, and after a few seconds, turned as unhurriedly back towards the left, south, southwest, south, southeast, east. And that is the end of the book. You get the sad ending. Bad end. Truly a bad end. Yep, but that is the end of the book. Everything goes back to the way it was. The men that are questioning society are no longer where society is. and the savage got tired. We start from checkpoint. I don't think he even saved. Not once in the entire book, I don't think he saved his story. Right? What a scrub. But yes, in the end, he kills himself. And I was like, what happens in the book? That's why if you read anything else other than what I told you to read, you would get so spoiled. And I was just like, oh shit, that's what happens. But yes. I am gonna go get some cheesecake now. You were saying something. Oh, maybe it won't. Hell yeah. Alright. I'm gonna stop recording. Thank you so much for listening. I think I know which book I want to read next. And it's inspired because I finished watching it with my boyfriend. And now we're watching the sequel. So next time I will be reading, it's a long book, so it's gonna be a long one. But it's gonna be a fun one. It's a book on Kyoshi. I don't know if you guys are for Avatar: The Last Airbender fans. That's what I'm gonna be reading. Kyoshi's book. But yeah, thank you so much. Bye bye.